The suitcase will caught on the threshold, and for 1 second, Clara Whitfield stood frozen between the life she was leaving and the one she couldn't yet see, listening to her husband's voice crack behind her as he asked if she was really going to do this over one mistake, and she turned around just long enough to say that it wasn't one mistake, it was 3 years of them, and then she walked into the rain without an umbrella, without a plan, and without a single tear, because she had already cried enough for both of them. The night swallowed her whole. Portland in November was not a kind city to the broken-hearted. The rain fell sideways, the streetlights flickered against wet asphalt, and Clara pulled her coat tighter as she walked without direction, her heels clicking a rhythm that sounded, to her own ears, like a countdown. She did not know where she was going. She only knew what she was leaving. 16 years of marriage, 4 of them spent pretending not to notice the perfume that wasn't hers, the late nights that stretched into excuses, the way Daniel had stopped looking at her like she mattered and started looking at her like she was furniture he hadn't gotten around to replacing. Tonight, the excuses had run out. Tonight, she had found the second phone. And tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Whitfield had chosen herself. If you believe people deserve a chance to choose themselves, even when it's terrifying, even when it costs them everything familiar, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me you're rooting for Clara, share this with someone who needs to hear that walking away can be an act of courage, and subscribe, because this story is about to show you exactly what it costs, and what it gives back. She ended up at a 24-hour diner 3 blocks from the apartment she no longer had a key to, because her sister had already changed the locks on the guest room out of some misplaced sense of protecting her own marriage from the mess of Clara's. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and old vinyl seats, and the waitress, a tired woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Dottie, took one look at Clara's soaked hair and mascara-streaked face and didn't ask questions. She just poured coffee and left a menu, the universal language of women who have learned not to pry into another woman's worst night. Clara sat in the corner booth and stared at the coffee steam curling upward, and for the first time she let herself ask the question she'd been avoiding for weeks: what now? She had no job. She'd left her career in interior design 8 years ago when Daniel insisted it made more sense for her to manage the house while he built his firm, a decision that had felt like partnership at the time and felt, tonight, like a cage she'd helped build with her own hands. She had $400 in a checking account Daniel didn't know existed, squirreled away over months of quiet foresight she hadn't admitted to herself was preparation. She had a suitcase with 3 days of clothes. And she had a phone buzzing relentlessly with his calls, each one a small violence she chose, again and again, to ignore. By the time the sun rose gray and reluctant over the wet city, Clara had made 2 decisions. The first was that she would not go back. The second was that she needed somewhere to sleep that wasn't a diner booth. She found a room above a hardware store advertised on a piece of paper taped to a bulletin board, cheap, furnished, month to month, cash accepted, and the landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Alvarez who ran the store below, looked at her for a long moment before handing her the key without asking for references. Sometimes people see exactly what you're running from without needing to be told, and they hand you grace instead of paperwork. The room was small and smelled of sawdust and old radiator heat, but it was hers, and that single fact undid something in Clara's chest that she'd been holding tight for years. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed that first night and cried, not the performative tears she'd learned to produce during arguments with Daniel, but something rawer, something that came from a place she didn't have words for, grief for the life she'd imagined at 24 when she married him, grief for the version of herself who had believed love was supposed to feel like this. The weeks that followed were an education in humility. Clara applied for jobs and heard nothing. She sold her wedding ring to a pawn shop for less than a third of what it was worth and used the money to buy groceries and a bus pass. She learned that Mr. Alvarez, despite his gruff exterior, left extra bread and eggs on her doorstep some mornings without ever mentioning it, and she learned to accept kindness without the shame she once would have felt, because shame was a luxury she could no longer afford. She learned that Daniel had told their mutual friends she'd had some kind of breakdown, that she was unstable, that he was worried about her, a narrative that cost her 2 friendships within a month, people who chose the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. It was in the fourth week, on a Tuesday that felt exactly like every other gray Tuesday, that Clara wandered into a small bookstore 2 blocks from her apartment to escape the cold, not to buy anything, just to stand somewhere warm that didn't require her to spend money she didn't have. The bookstore was narrow and crowded with shelves that leaned slightly, the kind of place that smelled like paper and dust and quiet permanence. Behind the counter stood a man perhaps a few years older than her, with silver threading through dark hair and reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, and he glanced up when the bell over the door chimed and said nothing at all, which Clara appreciated more than she could explain. She wandered the aisles for nearly an hour, running her fingers along spines she couldn't afford, and when she finally approached the counter to apologize for taking up space without buying anything, the man, whose name, she would learn, was Thomas, simply asked if she'd found anything that spoke to her. She told him, without meaning to, more truth than she'd told anyone in a month. She told him about the marriage, about the second phone, about the room above the hardware store and the $400 that had dwindled to less than $60. She didn't know why she told him. Perhaps it was the safety of a stranger, someone who owed her no history and could offer no judgment rooted in old loyalties. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when she finished, embarrassed at having unloaded so much onto a man ringing up used paperbacks, he simply said that his bookstore needed help 3 days a week, nothing glamorous, mostly shelving and register work, but it paid, and if she wanted it, it was hers. Clara took the job the way a drowning person takes a rope, without dignity, without hesitation, and with a gratitude so fierce it frightened her. The work itself was simple, but something about the rhythm of it, the quiet order of organizing shelves and recommending novels to strangers, began to stitch something back together inside her that she hadn't realized was torn. She started reading again, something she'd stopped doing years ago when Daniel had called it a waste of time better spent on the house. She started noticing the way morning light fell through the bookstore's front window, the way certain customers came in every week just for the company, the way Thomas remembered small details about everyone who walked through his door, the elderly woman who liked mysteries with female detectives, the teenage boy who was secretly writing poetry and pretending to browse the sports section. Thomas never asked Clara for more than she offered. He never pushed, never flirted, never made her feel like her brokenness was a problem to be solved by a man's attention, which after Daniel felt like its own kind of miracle. Over the months, in fragments and quiet conversations during slow afternoons, she learned that Thomas had lost his wife to cancer 6 years earlier, that he'd kept the bookstore running because closing it would have felt like losing her twice, that he understood, in his own way, what it meant to rebuild a life from wreckage you never asked for. There was no dramatic confession of feeling, no sudden embrace in the stacks. There was only the slow accumulation of trust, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply becomes, one ordinary day at a time, the ground beneath your feet. 6 months after she'd walked into the rain with a suitcase and no plan, Clara received the divorce papers finalizing what she'd already ended in her heart the night she found that phone. She signed them at Thomas's small kitchen table, in the apartment above the bookstore that she'd moved into 3 months prior, not out of desperation this time but out of a choice made with clear eyes and a steady heart. Thomas made her tea while she signed, and when she set down the pen, he didn't offer congratulations or platitudes. He simply asked if she wanted to take a walk, and she said yes, and they walked through the same wet Portland streets that had once swallowed her whole, except now the rain didn't feel like drowning. It felt like washing. Clara's story is not a fairy tale of instant rescue, it's something better, something truer. It's proof that walking away from what breaks you doesn't guarantee an easy landing, but it makes room for something real to find you. If this story has touched even a small piece of your heart, if you've ever had to choose the terrifying unknown over a familiar pain, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your own thoughts, share it with someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real, and subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one. Before we reach the final moments of Clara's journey, I want you to comment the word hope below if you believe, like she came to believe, that walking away from what hurts you is not the end of your story but the beginning of the one you were always meant to live. A year to the day after she left, Clara stood in the bookstore rearranging a display of new releases when Thomas came up behind her, quietly, the way he did most things, and set a small wrapped box on the counter beside her hand without a word. Inside was not a ring, not yet. Thomas understood better than most that some hearts need time even after they've healed, but a key, a small brass key to the apartment upstairs, engraved simply with her name, Clara, because he wanted her to know, without pressure or expectation, that this was hers now too, this space, this life, this quiet unhurried love that had grown between the shelves of second-hand paperbacks. She stood there holding that key, thinking of the woman who had stood frozen on a threshold a year earlier, soaked and shaking and certain she was destroying her life, and she understood now what she couldn't have known then, that some doors have to close completely before you can see the ones quietly waiting to open. She had walked out on one man that rainy November night, uncertain and afraid, telling herself only that she would not let herself regret it. She hadn't. Not once. Because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is trust that the story isn't over just because one chapter has ended in the rain. Sometimes it's only just beginning, waiting patiently on a quiet street, behind an unassuming door, for you to walk in and finally come home to yourself.